Another objection is that God approves of slavery in the Bible, but this is simply not the case. Firstly, slavery as we understand it was not approved of or even talked about by God. So when we think of the word slave, we think of the African slave trade, these terrible conditions where people were kidnapped or they were prisoners of war in Africa and then sold. Um, a more proper term would be indentured servant, or in some cases, prisoner of war. And here's an example from the Bible. This is in Genesis chapter 47. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my Lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my Lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made them servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. So the people exchanged themselves for provisions because they could not provide for themselves. It was not permanent and it was not forced. Secondly, in Israel's law, indentured servants were to be released after 6 years of labor and were not to be mistreated or cheated out of pay. So this is from Exodus chapter 22. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. And so we see that slavery being described was not at all the same thing as when we think of when we traditionally hear the word slavery, but it was a voluntary, mutually beneficial, consensual relationship. And it had rules which safeguarded the slaves, such as limited servanthood. You would never find this in something like the Codes of Hammurabi, which is a contemporary work which describes slaves, or even within the antebellum period of America or the African slave trade. So here's a verse. Here's a verse that kind of goes more in depth with it. When men quarrel, so they're both free, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and have him thoroughly healed. And these are two freedmen fighting. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. That's a capital statement. If a slave owner killed their slave in the South during the period of antebellum or the slave period, there'd be nothing wrong. They would say, "Oh no, that he could do whatever he wants." But if the slave survives the year or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Now, I want to talk about this part. People say the slave's his money, like people are property now. And I just want to say this notion of the slave being his money is trying to make the point that the slave is under the authority for the purpose of work. If the master harms his slaves and he survives, but he's also hurt him, he's limiting his work. In other words, he shouldn't treat his slave bad because he's his money, because it's worse for him. Especially if he kills him, then he's going to die. He's going to face capital punishment because slaves were considered humans, as they are, and it would be capital punishment, life for life. And then another thing, God's law was never God's ultimate plans, but it served to highlight the sinfulness of man and their fallen status. And this is clear from Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees. This is what it says. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" He said to them, "Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." So we see from Jesus that God permitted certain practices which were not ideal. Well, because when you work with imperfect beings, you cannot operate under functionally perfect guidelines. You wouldn't place perfect standards on imperfect people. And with that being said, it's clear that indentured servanthood is addressed in the Torah. That does not mean that God endorses it as desirable. The consequences which brought about the need for indentured servanthood are a result of sin. And if God didn't give guidelines, think about this. If God didn't give guidelines, this would be happening either way, because there would be people who would be out of money, out of land, and in need of food. And so what would they do? They would sell out their services. Now, if God didn't give commandments and he didn't give guidelines, they'd be treated a lot worse. But it's actually an act of grace that God provided guidelines because this is something that was going to happen otherwise or anyways. So when we look at things in the Old Testament, we have to understand that God was making a theological point by saying, all these things are guidelines of your fallen world. They're a result of your sin. And then also, if he didn't provide the guidelines, things would be a lot worse.